12. That's the number of black soul artists who walked into a modest little house in Detroit, signed Motown contracts, helped build the most influential black-owned record label in history, and never lived long enough to grow old. Same building, same dream, same fate. People have tried to explain that away for decades. Some chalk it up to bad luck, while others wave it off with a casual excuse of just how things were back then. But when you slow the story down and really look at what happened to so many of these artists, after they stepped outside Motown's walls, the randomness just disappears. Familiar patterns start showing up and become increasingly uncomfortable the deeper you look. The kind of uncomfortable that makes you stop mid-thought and go, wait, why does this keep happening? And I'm not talking about some spooky superstition or pretending Gordy was lurking in the shadows like some cartoon villain. That version of the story is too easy, and honestly, too lazy too. So what is the real explanation behind so many Motown stars dying young? And what is this untold curse of Hitsville? To understand that, let's rewind all the way back to the beginning, to a moment when Motown felt like the safest place a black artist could possibly land. The empire begins, Hitsville's promise. When Gordy launched Motown in the late 1950s, it felt like a radical promise instead of just another record label, especially at a time when black musicians were being chewed up by the industry and spat out with nothing to show for it. Gordy sold Motown as a family, not just contracts and percentages, but community. There were etiquette classes, finishing schools, choreography rehearsals, even image coaching. Artists weren't only learning how to sing, but also being taught how to move, talk, dress, and survive in a racist industry that was already waiting for them to slip. And for a while, it really did feel like magic. That little house became Hitsville, USA, pumping out record after record that crossed racial lines and dominated the charts. For black performers, this kind of stability was previously unheard of. Regular paychecks, national exposure, and a buffer between them and crooked promoters. Gordy positioned himself as the guy who understood the game and could keep his artists safe while they played it. But here's the thing about protection that comes with rules. Those rules ultimately start to tighten. And that's exactly what happened with Motown. It was a label running on control. Long contracts, strict creative oversight, grueling touring schedules that never really let up. Artists were expected to stay on the road, stay visible, stay profitable, often without fully understanding how the money flowed or how fragile that success really was. Ownership wasn't even part of the conversation. Financial literacy barely existed. Healthcare wasn't something anyone planned around. There was one simple, unspoken assumption. As long as the hits keep coming, everything else will sort itself out. At first, no one questioned it. And honestly, why would they? The early years felt like a honeymoon phase. The music was everywhere. Careers were exploding. Motown was not only winning, but it was changing the entire culture. But beneath that shine, small cracks were forming. Creative frustration showed up early. Artists who wanted to stretch, write their own songs, or push beyond the Motown formula often found themselves hitting invisible walls. The sound was the brand, and Gordy guarded it fiercely. Not long after, money questions began to follow as well. Royalty statements were confusing while accounting felt opaque. And when artists started pushing back or asking uncomfortable questions, that's when the mood shifted. Suddenly, the idea of leaving Motown, or even hinting at it, came with consequences. Various albums got shelved, and the momentum stalled completely. Then came the lawsuits that dragged on long enough to drain finances and energy. And what became painfully clear over time was this. Motown knew how to build stars inside its ecosystem, but it didn't equip them for life beyond it. Walking away didn't mean freedom, it meant exposure. This is where the pattern starts to come into focus, and once you see it, it's hard to unsee. What's unsettling is how similar these stories start to feel. If you trace the timeline, numerous names would begin to surface. Sandra Tilly, Mary Wells, Eddie Kendricks, Tammi Terrell. These were all different voices and different journeys, but endings that rhyme in ways that feel far too neat. At this point, you don't even need the full details to feel it. Something in the structure was just broken. And when you go deeper into these individual stories, That's when you realize this pattern didn't stop with the overlooked names. It reached the icons as well, the artists who seemed untouchable from the outside. By the time we reach the final story in this series, the idea of a Motown curse stops sounding like myth and starts sounding like consequence. Because if someone like Marvin Gaye, one of the most celebrated artists of the 20th century, couldn't survive what came after Motown, then it forces an uncomfortable question. What chance did anyone else really have? But before we get to his tragic story, we need to sit with the early warning signs. The artists who fell through the cracks first. The stories that didn't make headlines but quietly set the blueprint for everything that followed. And once you really hear what happened to them, it becomes impossible to hear Motown the same way again. The artists with all the same fate. Let's start with Sandra Tilly, because her story is something that sneaks up, taps you on the shoulder, and then refuses to let go once you realize what you're actually looking at. Sandra was never marketed as a star. Motown didn't build posters around her face or push her name to the front of the stage. Inside the system, she was something far more practical and far less celebrated. A solution. A reliable voice. Someone who could step in, blend perfectly, and keep the machine running without disrupting the brand. When she joined Martha and the Vandellas in 1968, filling in for Rosalind Ashford, there was no big announcement or grand storyline. But once Sandra was in that spot, she knew it wasn't a temporary gig. She recorded with the group, toured relentlessly, and earned her place the hard way. Sandra sang on "Bless You" while standing on stage at the Copacabana, one of the most prestigious venues in the country, with Judy Garland sitting in the audience. That's the kind of moment artists dream about their whole lives. For 4 years, Sandra Tilly lived the Motown dream exactly as it was advertised. World-class stages, international tours, applause from legends. But then, in 1972, the Vandellas disbanded in an abrupt move. No soft landing, no long-term plan, and no gentle transition into whatever came next. Sandra's story then took an especially cruel turn when she did everything right afterwards but still met a tragic fate. She didn't fight Motown or made a fiasco out of why Vandellas had disbanded. She just walked away, got married, moved to Texas, and built a quiet life that had nothing to do with record charts or spotlights. If these stories followed fairy tale logic, this would be the peaceful ending where the music fades out and the credits roll. But instead, the mysterious Hitsville curse showed up. In 1979, the headaches started. Not the kind you pop an aspirin for, but the kind that stop you in your tracks. Doctors eventually found a brain tumor, and from that moment on, Sandra's life became a cycle of hospitals, surgeries, and recovery rooms. This is where the Motown story goes completely silent. There were no calls, no financial cushion, no royalties stepping in to soften the blow. Just a woman who had once performed for packed houses now fighting for her life in near total obscurity. On September 9, 1983, during what was supposed to be another routine procedure in Las Vegas, Sandra Tilly's brain hemorrhaged on the operating table. She was only 37 years old, and when she was buried in Highland Park Cemetery in Ohio, there wasn't even a headstone marking where she lay. That detail alone tells you almost everything you need to know. A woman who sang for Judy Garland, who helped carry one of Motown's most successful groups through years of touring, rests in an unmarked grave. Not because she didn't matter, but because once the system was done with her, there was nothing left to hold her up. Then there's Mary Wells, and her story hits even harder because she wasn't on the margins but right at the center of the Motown universe. Before Diana Ross became a household name and before the Supremes took over the world, Mary Wells was the first queen, the one who showed Motown how to turn talent into history. Her song, My Guy, climbed to #1 in 1964 when she was only 20, and practically defined what early Motown sounded like. The Beatles adored her, so much so that they asked her to open for them on tour, which frankly is the kind of endorsement that could make any rising star feel untouchable. In short, Mary wasn't just successful, she was foundational. So when she made the decision to leave Motown at the absolute peak of her fame, it looked bold, daring, and maybe even revolutionary. But in hindsight, it also carried a kind of recklessness baked in by circumstance. 21st century retrospectives make it seem like a clean break. But at the time, it was fraught with pressure and uncertainty. 21st Century Fox had offered her a $500,000 deal that promised movies, music, and crossover stardom, the kind of deal any ambitious young artist would jump at, especially one who had already conquered her first mountain and was itching for the next. But stepping away from Motown meant you were pulling the plug on your own career. The Fox deal quickly unraveled, the movies never materialized, and the hits started to dry up, leaving Mary in an industry that had built her up and then left her to navigate its shifting currents on her own. By the 1970s, she was performing in small clubs, singing the same songs that once echoed through stadiums and television sets. These were the kind of gigs where nobody was waiting to hand you a contract or a check that matched your contribution to the sound of a generation. The spotlight that had made her a queen dimmed, and with it came a pressure and mental toll that no one could have prepared her for. She developed a relentless sense of being faded away, of seeing younger voices take the stage, while the one that had set the standard was quietly sidelined. By the 1980s, Mary Wells was living on welfare, raising 4 children without health insurance, and struggling to survive in a country that still adored her voice on the radio, but had long stopped paying her for it. Decades of relentless touring, endless studio sessions, and the emotional weight of being controlled, marketed, and replaced by the very label that built her had taken a toll on her body and mind. And when doctors finally diagnosed her with laryngeal cancer in 1990, there was no safety net waiting for her. Just like the story of Sandra Tilly, there was no Motown stepping in with support, no long-term care plan, and no royalties quietly covering hospital bills. Instead, friends, fellow artists, and charity organizations had to step into a gap that should never have existed. The Rhythm and Blues Foundation organized emergency fundraising, Diana Ross sent a personal donation, Bruce Springsteen added his name to the list, but even then, it was a stopgap and a patchwork where the system had failed. Mary spent her final months not in glamorous studios or performing for screaming fans, but testifying before Congress, fighting for cancer research funding with the same drive she had once poured into every note of every hit she recorded. The woman who had put Motown on the national map, whose voice had defined an era, was silenced not just by illness, but by the slow burn of being discarded by the industry that had once celebrated her. On July 26, 1992, she passed away in Los Angeles at just 49 years old, a voice and a spirit that had helped shape history, fading quietly in the aftermath of a system that celebrated brilliance but offered almost nothing for the people behind it once the music stopped. Mary Wells ultimately became a symbol of what happens when the bright lights of fame move on, leaving the people who made them behind. And that brings us to the story of Eddie Kendricks. And by the time his story unfolded, the pattern stopped being subtle. Eddie was the falsetto, that smooth, sky-high voice that gave the Temptations their elegance and emotional pull. Before David Ruffin became the face of the group, Eddie was the sound that set them apart. Songs like Just My Imagination didn't just work because of melody, they worked because Eddie made longing sound beautiful. But Motown wasn't built for balance. Power struggles were constant. Touring was relentless. Creative frustration simmered. By 1971, Eddie had had enough and left the group, believing a solo career might finally give him space to breathe. For a moment, it did. Keep on Truckin' went #1 in 1973, proving Eddie could stand on his own. But the industry's attention span is short, and once the hits slowed, the reality set in. Money thinned out. The road never stopped. And Eddie, who had been chain-smoking since his teenage years, kept pushing his body harder than it could handle. In 1991, doctors found lung cancer and removed one of his lungs. Eddie still went back on tour, performing through pain because that's what artists without safety nets do. On October 5, 1992, just 3 months after Mary Wells passed, Eddie Kendricks died in Birmingham, Alabama. He was 52 years old. And then there's Tammi Terrell, whose story feels especially cruel because it never even had time to fully bloom. Tammi was 22 when she collapsed on stage in Marvin Gaye's arms during a performance of Your Precious Love in 1967. One moment she was singing, the next her body gave out. Doctors quickly diagnosed a malignant brain tumor, but her story had already been shaped by trauma long before that night. Before Motown, she endured an abusive relationship with James Brown. Later, she dated David Ruffin, and witnesses claimed that earlier in 1967, Ruffin struck her in the head with a motorcycle helmet during an argument. No one can say definitively what caused the tumor, but the timing has haunted everyone connected to her story. Tammi endured 8 brain surgeries over 3 years. By 1970, she was blind, confined to a wheelchair, and weighed just 93 pounds. She died on March 16, 1970, at 24 years old. Her mother barred Motown executives from the funeral. Marvin Gaye was the only exception, and Marvin never recovered. That loss cracked something inside him, and that crack widened over the years until it consumed everything. Which brings us to the final collapse. And this is where the whole story tightens its grip, because Marvin Gaye isn't just another chapter in the Motown saga. He's the moment when everything you've been quietly noticing snaps into focus. Marvin Gaye's tragic story. Marvin was an absolute hitmaker, but more than that, he was the guy asking the uncomfortable questions while everyone else was trying to keep the party going. When Motown was built on love songs and polish, Marvin showed up with "What's Going On" and basically said, "Okay, but have you looked outside lately?" That album wasn't just music, it was a conscience pressed into vinyl. War, police brutality, addiction, environmental collapse. Marvin was talking about all of it while still sounding like silk. That combination made him untouchable in the eyes of fans and deeply inconvenient to the people signing the checks. Gordy didn't want "What's Going On." He thought it was risky, too political, too messy. Marvin pushed anyway, and when it became one of the most important albums of the century, it proved something dangerous. Marvin wasn't just a star inside the Motown system, he was bigger than it. And once that realization hit, the relationship was never going to survive. By the time Marvin finally walked away from Motown in 1982, it wasn't some victorious mic drop moment. It was more like someone leaving a long, exhausting marriage with emotional baggage stuffed into every pocket. He was drowning in IRS debt, something like $6 million hanging over his head. His cocaine habit had stopped being recreational and started feeling medicinal, and the grief he never processed after Tammi Terrell's death had calcified into something heavy and permanent. People love to talk about Marvin's genius, but they forget how fragile he was underneath it. He carried pain the way some people carry melody, instinctively, constantly, without ever really setting it down. Losing Tammi didn't just break his heart, it cracked his sense of safety. After that, drugs weren't about partying, they were about quieting the noise. By 1984, Marvin wasn't living like a legend. He was back in his parents' house in Los Angeles, which tells you everything you need to know about how far things had slid. He was paranoid, deeply depressed, convinced people were watching him, exhausted in that bone-deep way that sleep doesn't fix. And being back home meant being back under the same roof as his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., a man whose relationship with his son had always been explosive. Their history wasn't just tense, it was violent. Marvin Sr. had beaten him as a child, verbally and physically dominated him for years, and even as Marvin became famous, that power dynamic never really flipped. Fame doesn't magically heal childhood trauma. Sometimes it just gives it a bigger stage. On April 1, 1984, just one day before Marvin's 45th birthday, another argument broke out between his parents. Marvin stepped in, like he had probably done 1,000 times before, trying to stop it from getting worse. Voices rose, tempers flared, something tipped. His father went to his bedroom and came back with a gun. 2 shots. The first tore through Marvin's body with devastating precision. The second was fired at point-blank range as he lay dying. Marvin Gaye died in his childhood home, not on a stage, not in a studio, but in the place that had always made him feel small. And here's the part that still makes people uneasy decades later. Marvin had given that gun to his father as a gift just months earlier. According to his brother Frankie, Marvin's final words suggested he had reached a point where he wanted the pain to stop, even if he couldn't be the one to pull the trigger himself. Suicide by proxy isn't a comfortable phrase, but it hangs in the air around this story whether people want to say it out loud or not. Marvin Gaye was just 44 years old, and this is why his death reframes everything. This was neither someone forgotten by history, nor it was a cautionary tale about obscurity or fading relevance. Marvin had awards, acclaim, influence, and one of the most celebrated catalogs in music history. If someone like him could still end up broke, addicted, emotionally shattered, and dead before 50, then the problem wasn't individual weakness. It was structural. By the time Marvin's story ends, the word curse starts to feel less like superstition and more like shorthand. Not for something supernatural, but for a system that took everything artists had while they were young and brilliant, then left them to navigate the wreckage alone once the machine moved on. And at that point, the idea of coincidence feels impossible to defend. So when you finally zoom out and take all of this in at once, the story stops feeling like a streak of heartbreak and starts looking like a design flaw. Not some cartoonish evil master plan, but the kind of damage that happens when a system is obsessed with output and speed and never pauses to ask what happens to people once they stop producing. Motown was a miracle factory, no doubt about it, but miracles built on instant momentum don't always come with seatbelts. And that's also why people still reach for the word curse. Not because something mystical was lurking in the walls of Hitsville, but because the outcomes lined up with eerie consistency. Young deaths, financial collapses, illnesses met with silence, charities stepping in where billion-dollar success stories stayed absent. And all this leaves us with one unsettling question. Was it all just a tragic coincidence? Or was there a darker and deeper underlying reason for it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and for more interesting peeks into the lives of Black artists, take a look at Black Wealth.